So yeah, what was it? Gel kept saying me that it's like, oh, Throne wants to pick a fight, and I'm like, oh, what? I'm like, I gotta look at this. Um,
I, I don't really think it's. Look, I mean, I'm far less manic and crazy than it comes out. It's just like online, the filter goes away because you know what? It's text. You can't. There is no good way to convey any meaning beyond the words in
mhm,
text that no one can see a face to. You know,
right.
but I mean, I'd say it's a battle of the minds, but I think I'm at a bit of a disadvantage.
I know. I mean, it's you bring up some really great points, and they're the kind of points that I think need to be brought up. So I'm actually kind of feeling, how should I say, strained in articulating what I already know about this, but haven't had the opportunity or the pressure to need to put it into words. And so you're not going to be the only one that's going to present these questions forward, so I might as well try to get used to them.
Yeah, well, I had, and I mentioned once I was writing a post about the sort of journey through the whole typology thing, and I thought, you know what, in that post, I kind of went on a little tangent about how essentially and it came out really pompous, which is why I didn't post it. Where it's like, oh, you know, I'm the dragon, you're the king, and it's like, in a sense, it's true because I'm threatening chaos. Whether I can deliver it, I'm still threatening chaos.
Right. Yes. And that's interesting. Well, I don't know if you consider, like, I took what you just said right now as from a Jungian sense. I'm not sure if that's how you meant it, but from a Jungian sense, it's yeah, well, chaos either leads to, you know, a disassembly of something or a refinement of it through kind of like trial by fire.
Mm-hmm.
So your criticism either can make the theory collapse, which it should if it can, or stronger, which is also good. So good both ways. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, I hate to take, and the thing is, I really respect the system. It's just there are things that I look at, and it's like, you know, I don't know. See, and this is where I'm going to struggle with articulation. Is I don't know how to convey exactly what goes through my mind when I think about this stuff. But it's like I'll be driving my car and I'll go, oh, you know what? There's a problem that I didn't. And this happens with every system. So
Mm-hmm.
don't think I'm targeting you or you know cog type or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that. It's just, I work in IT. I think of how to fix something. I'm like, oh shoot, I forgot this. You know, set of 15 steps. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll think about them for 5 days, and I'll come out with a solution that kind of works, kind of doesn't work, but it takes everything that I did before and throws it in the trash can. So,
Right. Yeah. No. Like I said, I appreciate it. So let me try to start with something because there's a lot of points that you touched upon, and you know, like I said, or like you said, text is kind of limited, so I wanted to elaborate. And feel free to bounce off of any of this. Uh, but so it was a really great point that you brought up that says, you know, what makes you think, or what makes me think, or anybody think that their parameters from which they measure, let's say, human variability, human personality, are the right parameters, and so it's a bit, and that's why I think that really the only reason why I have dedicated so much time to cognitive type going forward, knowing that there's already all these different models out there that suffice for whatever, is because I think that this dice that we were talking about, this die, is a thing, and by a thing I mean like it exists as more than just a set of concepts that people dabble with back and forth. It has some root biology to it that needs to be uncovered. And when it is uncovered, then it's like everybody was looking at it from a different angle. You can imagine like a crowd of people, but then you narrow in on what they were all looking at, and then suddenly all of these different angles converge and make sense of the same observation. And so, if in a way you could almost say all of the different angles that are looking at the die are quote unquote valid in a way. So let me give you an example. Like the big five, I believe is entirely valid, but it's a very low resolution. So if you want to say human variability in the human race, at the most simplistic resolution is divided up into those five categories. Well, but then it's like, well, what's causing those five categories? The big five won't tell you, but they are kind of like these auras, these energetic fields that emerge from a deeper, more complex system, which is the functions at work. So that's an example of where both can coexist, because you can still get the big five as a result of the end effects of having the what I call the temperaments that emerge from the functions.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, sure. I mean, one thing you mentioned about resolution kind of, and maybe it's just the definition's kind of off in my head, but
Mm-hmm.
when you think of a lower resolution, from low resolution going to a higher resolution, one of the problems that you encounter inevitably when you start introducing more and more granularity is that it's not possible in any sense that if you were to reach the maximum level of granularity, that any person, I mean, think of the most SE heavy person that you know, like an SE lead who has developed nothing but their SE.
Mm-hmm.
They still wouldn't be 100% like the granular view of SE at the fundamental level.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, I should say at that really granular level.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, they would be SE. But, I mean, does that make any sense?
Yeah. And that's because they are a compound system, right? Other things are going on inside of them.
Well, right, but I mean, if SE, if we're still describing it in a purist sense, I guess
Mm-hmm.
if humans are not a closed system, how can we have pure descriptions of pure functions when we don't have pure functions?
So yeah, the distillation problem. See, this is why I have this love-hate relationship with Michael Pierce. I'm assuming you're familiar with Michael Pierce, right?
Yes.
He's a wonderful a distillator. I don't know if that's a word, but I'm going to use it. He distills he distills the essence of these functions. But you see, the problem is, like, yeah, it's so pure, and my TI loves this. Like, it's so pure in its concept, but at the same time, in that purity, it doesn't apply in the real world. Like, and you fail to identify its reality in another dimension. So it, like, you have this conceptual dimension in which you describe it perfectly. It's almost like math, you know, you describe an equation, but then it's like, well, does your theory actually align with the way of the world? So somewhere in between the two, you know, and if you do you know, theoretical physicists, you come across this problem too. Somewhere in between the two is the truth, which is, where does theory meet reality? And so I don't really entertain, I think Phibius was saying this too, I don't really entertain very airtight axiomatic concepts of the functions, because I don't think that's how they exist. I think they exist as these like I said, these architecture and structures of the mind that interplay with everything else to create fuzzy end effects, which we see as behaviors. And so, like, if you were to say, if you ask me, what do you think the fundamental core root definition of SE is going to be when it's, let's say, fully discovered, I would probably say something like, you know, it's these certain pairs of genes which are either passed on to one or the other, and these pairs of genes create this certain kind of, let's say, neural architecture. Well, not even neural architecture, but see, because in my mind, the brain is actually is algorithmic in the sense that oh shoot, well, I'm getting on a tangent, but in essence, the way in which the brain decides to do its feedback loop in which it creates reality has some instructions to it, and those instructions you know, are given to it by what I would assume are these functions. So it's a set of instructions which the instructions themselves aren't very impressive. They aren't very much. You could probably describe it very simply, like, for example, just how the Mandelbrot is like a couple of letters. It's just a small little phrase, but it gives rise to this enormous complexity. The function in itself is probably a little bit of a gene sequence, and it creates this certain architecture. And so then it's like, well, is that SE? Well, no, you can say that SE is the core thing, but also SE is everything that emerges, like the Mandelbrot, everything that emerges from that initial core thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, I've been sort of reforming the arguments because the problem, and this is where it's good to speak to the founder. You know, it's like
Sure.
a lot of people, they go, a lot of the folks here, well, it's a system that is described as being, so, and I don't want to say psychoanalytical, but essentially, what's the word? Yeah, my brain is sort of fried at the moment. Psychometric,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, no, if you're describing it as psychometrics, then everything I said was at least more or less somewhat valid. If it is biological, if that's the assertion, there's something more to it, which is,
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know if you're familiar with I don't want to say recent research, but it's a couple years old, where some psychologists and some neuroscientists were kind of working together, putting people through a great deal of stress, and it essentially caused them to go through an ego death.
Mm.
And they found that once they had collapsed their self-image into nothing, that there were superstructures within the mental landscape upon which their ego was rebuilt.
Mm.
From the biological perspective, yes, that makes a lot more sense. And that's where, like, a lot of my arguments became immediately invalid when you said that.
Gotcha. Well, great. Yeah, I'm glad to clarify that. And I think that's the only way to go forward, right? We can't keep playing this game where, everybody just creates these arbitrary little systems and each one has their pet theory. We have to get to the core reality here. And so one of the things that interests me initially about Nardi was that, well, he was mapping, brain regions or what have you, but what I liked about Nardi is he started to shift his attention more towards I've seen it described different ways in different articles, but some people call it neural clicks, and basically these wide scale, instead of looking at region by region, it's like these wide scale collaborative activities that the brain performs. It's almost like, see, one of the metaphors that I've felt most compelled by is to say that the brain is like an orchestra, and you have, let's say you have a string section over here, you have the brass section here, you have, and so a lot of players play in the orchestra, so the strings all play in a kind of rhythm, and so because the brain is not just chaotic, random chaotic thing. There's the reason we have consciousness at all is because there's a sequence, there's an order to this. So these brain regions kind of play in sync with each other, and so one activates another, and another, and they all kind of perform this super function, this super metabolic process that the brain needs to perform. And so, and it involves whatever key areas are necessary, from the auditory to the language centers, whatever's needed to accomplish that task. And so my suspicion is that, so let's say you have this orchestra. Let's go back to the orchestra. Well, who decides, or another way to think about it is like the operating system. Well, who decides how and why this orchestra plays the way it does? I think that's where the biological component is, and I think the main argument would be that there isn't just one orchestra. There isn't just one way that all human brains play their symphony. There are different ways, and these are part of a rooted structure that makes the whole brain activate in a certain way. And it doesn't even matter which section of the brain plays, because as we know from neuroplasticity, and also like left and right-handedness, like it seems like the brain allots different brain matter areas depending on what's needed. So, so it's a funny, but I'm starting to understand that you could almost, I might be wrong. I'm not a neuro person or not versed in all this, but I believe that you can almost think of the neurons of the neocortex as like a bandwidth or so like a how should I say, real estate, like almost like cognitive real estate, or these neurons are like real estate that the brain allots to sections depending on what it needs, and depending on how the brain forms from childbirth or whatever. So everyone's slightly different, but so you can imagine. Tell me to stop at any moment, by the way. You could imagine, let's say that you have this building, let's say a skyscraper, and you have all these rooms, right? And the CEO just bought the building, right? And he says, okay, I'm going to build a company here. I have all this real estate to work with. I have all these compartments, these cubicles. And he's like, I need a business analyst. I need one of these people. I need one of this. So he brings in his team, and they all occupy all the sections that are needed in order for the business to run. But so what matters less is who sits in what chair. What matters more is, do you have all the players in the sequence to get the job done, to make the business run? So
Mhm.
having all the components of consciousness is more important than where each component is necessarily located in the neocortex. But here, who came up with this quote unquote um, like architecture of the business? Like, who decides what all these players are, and all the positions that are to be filled? And that's where I think the algorithm of human consciousness is. The algorithm of human consciousness is how the brain unpacks itself into the available neural real estate based on the needs that the psyche has. So one of those needs, or well, four of those needs, I think, are the four functions that we inhabit. And they're not the only ones, but I think they're the ones that are key in forming these large-scale activities that the brain undergoes to organize itself in the world. That was super long, by the way, but go on. Sorry.
No, no, no. I'm kind of taking it and just processing it. It's.
Mhm.
I don't think I fundamentally disagree. I mean, I'm sure I'll wake up tomorrow morning and I'll have 5 or 6 things that are like, wait a minute. But I don't think at the moment I've got anything that really fundamentally, like, it's like, no, it's just like a knife in the side going, you can't believe that. It's like, no, I'm not having that issue at the moment. But I don't know. I mean, it could make sense. I mean, there's still a lot, and I guess my thing is, if we're going to claim that something is causal, then there has to be evidence of the causality. And the correlative evidence is compelling, at least to some degree. But there's still, I don't know, there's something missing. There's something missing that I can't put my finger on what it is. And it's not like, I mean, I'm assuming you're not a geneticist,
No.
and you said you're not a neuroscientist,
No.
and that's, yeah, I mean, it's like, it's not, we would need to get, or well, I say we, I act like we're comrades in this one, but in trying to make the system, in order to prove the causal relationship, we need to get it in front of the scientific community in some fashion, or at least get data that we can push down, that we can filter down. Which, I mean, you could even do, I don't know if there's a term for this specifically, but pairing studies. Like, you find a genetic study, then you pull those people into something like this. And obviously the funding for that is god awful. So this is a pipe dream on my end. But and at that point, yeah, then there's absolutely no. I mean, not after one test, but after enough of those tests, it's like your naysayers could just be whisked out of the room with a proverbial middle finger going, yep, better luck next time.
Yeah, exactly. Now, for me, the key takeaway from this is that I feel that there at least is a road that could be traveled in that direction. A lot of theories don't even have that. Like, they're kind of in a dead end where, like I say, especially with certain psychometrics, where you could only isolate your system to, refining your definitions and then fitting people according to definitions. So you say, yes, you are so and so type according to our definitions, and so our definitions are airtight. But what is that definition? What is it like? Does it even matter how your boxes are laid out if your boxes don't match anything beyond themselves? So kind of this isolated echo chamber. So I was so tempted. I'm always so tempted. As a TI lead, I write about this. I love beautiful airtight systems, and of course any logic type can do that. But like, my point being that it's folly. It's folly to do that. You have to, and it is facing chaos. You have to risk collapsing your system by pushing it against reality. And it's painful because as you do that, things get chipped away. As you do that, you have to rethink your ideas over and over, and it's arduous. And even if we haven't yet, had a grant and actually done more restricted studies, even the layman pilot studies we've done have shifted and strengthened the theory in certain directions.
Mhm.
And it'll continue to do that because it depends on the earnestness and the transparency of the people that are building. Like how much are we checking ourselves? How much are we really honestly saying, nope, this is not proving out to be like it's not predictive the way that we thought, and adjusting accordingly. I think that right now cognitive type is in this phase where there are so many unknowns. As you said, it's not as comprehensive as socionics yet. It's so young that it's almost like it's not even worth bothering going into the rigid studies yet because there's still territory to unpack. But I feel that we're getting really close. Like for example, with the new edition of the development levels, we're coming up with certain pairs of people, visually typed pairs of people according to the the development levels that, oh my gosh, like they could literally be twins in some sense. And if we're getting that, like so if we get to a point where visually typing somebody puts them into a category, where you can say whatever about the category, but whatever the category happens to be, the people in there, in that category are, behaviorally and cognitively, they think the same, they act the same, they do the same thing, they're attracted to the same lifestyles, then you've got something very strong. And it's not strong for the reason, as a psychometric would be, it's not strong for the reason that, oh, it proves that the behaviors match. It's actually like the behaviors matching is almost a side effect of saying you've got something really good underneath the behavior, which is causing the behavior. That's my aspiration anyway. But,
Well, and jumping just for a half a second, jumping back to the socionics thing.
mm-hmm.
When I say it's not as complex as socionics, that's not a dig. I mean, I love socionics just with the whole, the pure math of it is so sweet.
Mm-hmm.
And then the interplay of I mean, if you dig into the dichotomies, I actually think that is something that any system could really push for. I mean, even something like the Big Five, you could say, okay, well, how do these three interplay in this fashion? How do these how do these aspects or the facets of the aspects interplay? And you could come up with a very interesting picture.
Mm-hmm.
But I think socionics, more so than anything, suffers from bloat. And that's something that I don't necessarily want CT, or I don't, do you kind of call it CT for shorthand, or
Sure.
do you just say cognitive? Okay.
I see CT.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not stepping on anybody's toes on this one.
Oh, no.
But, I don't think it would be a good idea for CT to get that bloated. And that's actually one of the reasons why I don't want to say it pisses me off, but it kind of throws me off, where it's like the definition pages. I mean, whether I relate to them or not is irrelevant. It's like trying to create a page of all of these, like, okay, this is what behavior is expected of X, Y, and Z. It's like, okay, well, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that. And it's like, well, whatever the heck type I am, I'm like 1/10 of this and like 2/10 of that. And and it's not, it creates that bloat unnecessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I mean, if it's going to be genetic, it almost, I almost wonder if it shouldn't be lower resolution as a genetic concept, because I kind of see it going both ways. You had mentioned that the Big Five is fairly low resolution.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you're going with the pure Big Five, I would agree. But if you go with things like, the Big Five aspect scale that Jordan Peterson created, or the IPIP Neo, which has 30 facets, you get a very interesting picture. And it's like, there's more interplay that I've noticed there, where, for example, I have a difficult time having long-term relationships with people who are not extremely high in industriousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that's just strengthening a whole lot of concepts about my my psyche, which is fine. I'm not really arguing about that at this stage. I'm not worried about that so much.
Mm-hmm.
But in that sort of line, it's like, how would, Cogtype can't really account for the idea of, well, like, okay, I don't get along with people with very low industriousness, but I get along with people with exceptionally high industriousness, regardless of any functions that they use.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are a lot of people who have the sort of FE signals or something like that, and it's like, well, you can look at them and say, yeah, they are hyper industrious. And despite the fact that we shouldn't jive on quite a number of accounts, I mean, even assuming I am a delta type,
Hmm.
you know, I work with about 6 or 7 people who I'm fairly certain are alphas and betas,
Hmm.
who we get along swimmingly because we're hyper industrious.
Hmm.
But it wouldn't make sense from the frame of at least from what I understand as the frame of CT, and I'm very possibly wrong. I mean, that's where this kind of thing comes in. I mean, for example, do judgment leads tend to be more attracted to other judgment leads, and that's more research that would have to be
Yeah,
conducted, I'm sure.
we haven't really started to investigate, like, say, the compatibility of relationships or anything like that.
Mhm.
So I don't have much to say, but what I can say in general is that uh, well, I mean, this is very general, but we've noticed that, you know, there are two kinds of attraction mainly. There's likes attracts likes, and then opposites attract. I don't know why, but it's like if somebody is the same as you in some way, in whatever way that is, you tend to like them because of that. Or if somebody has something that's completely opposite of what you have, you tend to like them because they have something you don't like, you don't have. Uh, the more contrasted it is, the more interesting the more interested the psyche seems to be. But this is no theory. This is just my personal observation. But yeah, yeah. So about the descriptions, the definitions or profiles. Uh, yeah, like I understand the grief you have with it too. I have the same grief, and one of the things that's great about just having, like I said, a lower resolution, a succinct definition for something is. You know, nothing that is nothing that is there that doesn't match is there. But I think that I said that kind of backwards. Nothing that is there doesn't match. Anyway, so let me just start it. Let me start over. The way that I look at this is, you could almost say it's more statistical. Like, uh, you may be the percentage that doesn't relate to a certain, let's say, habit or proclivity, but if you average it out, certain things are more common in certain types, or when certain people have stronger functions. So,
Mhm.
but what exactly it is kind of like, and see, this is one of the things that I love statistics for, is in statistics, you don't necessarily have absolutes, but you have degrees. And uh, so let's say, for example, I say that a TE lead is very likely to be a busybody and have a business and start their own business. That's a very exact phrase. They start their own businesses, let's say by age 30. They've started their own business. I might get a percentage in the 75%, you know, maybe 25% of them don't, for whatever reason. But let's say for compared to the average person, let's say 40% of them start their own business. So that's significantly more than the average, even though, you know,
Right.
every fourth person, every fourth TE leader is going to come by and say, hey, this is wrong. You know, is it worth bothering noting this at all, or is it just thrown away because it's not 100% accurate? And that's a question that, you know, I think that any sort of psychometric deals with, which is the behavioral angle, the behavioral. But I do include it there because I think there's a lot of information there that's necessary. So, uh, and
Yeah, no,
mhm.
I can see that. I can see that.
But that's kind of how it should be taken. And I think, I mean, I've been very careful with the behaviors. The 8 function profiles in the beginning of the behaviorism section, they say, let's say, for example, here, not all SI users have all SI traits, but more of them will be present in proportion to how prioritized the conscious the function is in the psyche.
I see. So you can quote yourself, but I can't.
Wait, that was funny. You said that
No,
earlier.
I just gonna give you a hard time on that.
Yeah,
It's a bad habit of mine to do that. But
I
no,
don't,
yeah, no,
I
and
don't
I
see anything wrong with that, but, but yeah.
oh, no, I was just the one of our conversations, like, what was it, 4 or 5 weeks ago? I can't even remember at this point. It was something like, you know, because I kept quoting a lot of your
Oh
older
yeah, yeah,
posts.
yeah, yeah.
And it really, you know, again, none of that's meant in a negative way. It's just kind of to clarify. It's like, well, here's who said it, and therefore there's whatever weight comes with that name
Yeah,
can
yeah.
be attached to this insofar as they said it. But
Yeah, yeah.
So I figured I'd give you a hard time on that. But yeah, no,
No,
and
it's
I agree. I think the biggest problem that I had at the time, and it's confirmation bias. And I'm still not sure. I'll walk away from this conversation with a newfound respect for CT. I don't think I can wholeheartedly accept it, but I don't do that with anything. It's like
hmm
I can be 99.9% sure of something and still doubt it for the rest of my life.
right.
Sounds a lot worse than it really is, but I yeah, I don't know. I think the problem for me at the time is it's like I'm looking at the SI profile going, well, what the heck? I think I matched like one line in this whole thing. And
hmm
and then when you posted the SE profile, I'm going, okay, well that's me, that's me, that's me, that. So either I'm a really unhealthy person who just really loves thrills, or I'm a secret something or other with messed up signals, and it's like, well, which one is the most likely of those two? Well, clearly the one that makes me happy.
I see what you're saying. Uh, I mean, and I think Phibias touched on this, but if that's really happening at scale, then there's something wrong with the system, and it would need to be fixed. And we do fix things in that sense. These sort of these sort of sentences should, in theory, match more often than not. But also, one of the things that we've discovered is that, let's say, for example, a TESI, our previous assumption was that both the top two functions would be conscious in a standard development, but that actually isn't the case. It's just the first function that's conscious. And I've I've started to come across a lot of TESIs that actually really favor their NE and just neglect their SI altogether. It's very weird. Uh,
Hmm.
but yeah, because and like it's almost as if you could say that you're born into the certain quadrant
Hmm.
as a dominant function, and you have the dominant function, you have the quadrant. The other three, how you use them is kind of the other three are kind of they don't necessarily come into consciousness in a certain order. It depends on the person, their life path, their focus, what they choose to nurture into consciousness, and that's why we have a lot of well, not I wouldn't say a lot, but we have several uh, what I call them TENEs in psychology. Actually, Dave Powers being one of them, as I said.
Yeah. No, and I actually agree with that. Like when he used to say he was an INTJ, it's like, no, you're not an INTJ. I don't know what he was, but he wasn't an INTJ.
No, I
So,
don't
but
think
I
so.
mean, he uses the, yeah, it's like, dude, you're way too outgoing for that. I mean, for
Mm-hmm.
that matter, in traditional Myers-Briggs, you really don't seem a lot like an INTP. And
Mm-hmm.
that's again, I don't know why I want to qualify that by saying that's not an insult because I don't think that could, but maybe it could be taken that way, but that's not the way it's meant to be.
That's funny. No, no. By the way, you keep apologizing. You don't need to. I have a pretty thick skin too, so I totally I could take what you give at me and throw it back.